In the cool, wet spring of 1952, a woman named Cora Whitfield stood at the edge of 80 acres that had just become hers and watched 3 strangers drive survey stakes into her orchard. She was 38 that year. Newly the only keeper of ground, her father had planted tree by tree across 40 seasons. Elias Whitfield had died in February, quiet as a banked fire, and he had left her exactly 2 things. One was the orchard on the long bench above the river. Apple and cherry set in rows so straight you could sight a rifle down them. The other was a stack of grafting journals kept in his cramped, patient hand. The stakes were painted a bright, careless orange. They marched from the north fence straight across her finest cherry rows, and not one man among the 3 had thought to knock on her door. Cora walked out to the nearest stake and stood over it a long moment. Then she crouched, read the surveyor's crayon, and understood that someone in a far-off office had already decided what her land was for. She did not shout at the men. She watched them work, memorized their faces, and went back to the house to wait for whoever would come next. The one who came wore a gray coat that had never seen an orchard. He gave his name as Sedgwick, an agent for the Ashford and Western Railway, and he carried a leather folder the color of a saddle. She gave him coffee because her father would have, and she let him talk. "Mrs. Whitfield, I'll be brief," he said. "The company is putting a new grade down this valley, and the survey crosses your acreage. This is a courtesy call, nothing more. The right-of-way has already been granted." "Granted by whom?" she asked. "It is my orchard, and I did not grant anything. By the state, ma'am. They call it eminent domain. A railroad serves the public good, so the public lets it take the ground it needs. You will be paid a fair price for the strip we run through." He set a figure on the table. The price for a 60-foot corridor cut slantwise through the middle of her best trees. It was not a cruel number. It was only the number a man writes when the land in front of him is dirt, and nothing more. Cora looked at the check the color of weak tea, and then at the folder, and then out the window at the rows her father had bent his whole life to keep straight. "Those cherry trees are 30 years old," she said. "He grafted every one of them by hand. You cannot grow that back with a bank draft." "I am sorry," Sedgwick said, and to his small credit, he half meant it, "but the line is coming whether you sign or not. If I were you, I would take the money. Once the cut is made, this ground will not be worth what it was. Orchard land with a rail scar down the middle sells for pasture, if it sells at all. The crews came in June, when the cherries were still hard and green and the last apple blossom had only just let go. Cora heard them before she saw them. There was the cough of a work engine, the ring of axes, and then the long tearing groan a mature tree makes when it goes over, a sound she felt in her back teeth. She ran up the bench with her skirt gathered in her fists and stopped at the edge of what had been the finest quarter of the whole place. A dull gray locomotive sat idling on the fresh grade, and behind it a string of hoppers heavy with ballast stone. Between the new rails and her fence lay a wound 40 feet across, mature trees shoved into a tangle of pale roots and broken earth, blossom petals still clinging to limbs that would never set fruit again. Cora walked out onto the raw ground and lifted one hand, flat and open, toward the engine. As if a single palm could hold back 1,000 tons of steel, the engineer leaned from his cab and looked at her, not unkindly, and did not stop. He had a schedule to keep. She stood in the drifting dust until the last hopper had ground past, and the grit settled over the fallen petals like ash over a hearth. News travels a valley faster than any freight. By the end of that week, her neighbor Harlan Voss had leaned on her gate twice to tell her what everyone was already saying at the co-op and the feed store. "Cora, I am fond of you, so I will say it plain," Voss told her. "That orchard is cut in two, and a rail line runs straight down the wound. Land like that does not sell for orchard money anymore. Take what the company gave you. Take what I will add for the rest. and go live easy in town." "And do what in town, Harlan?" she asked. "Rest," he said. "You have surely earned it." She thanked him for the trouble of caring and did not sell so much as a fence rail. That night she carried a lamp out to the barn, took down her father's journals from the shelf where he had always kept them, and read until the oil in the lamp burned low and blue. Elias Whitfield had not been a sentimental man, but his journals were full of a stubborn, practical hope. He wrote about grafting most of all. He wrote of how a scion cut from one tree, bound to the rootstock of another, knits over a single season into one living thing sturdier than either had been apart. He wrote about bloom with the same care other men gave to money. On one page, underlined twice, he had listed which of his varieties flowered earliest and which held their blossom the longest, and beside the list he had written a sentence Cora read 3 times over: "A tree in full flower is the only advertisement that costs a man nothing and cannot be ignored." That sentence was the whole seed of it. The railway had opened a raw 60-foot corridor across her land, and every soul who ever rode that line would look straight out at it. She could plant that corridor to hide the tracks, as a shamed family draws a curtain across a broken window. Or she could plant it to be seen. Sitting there with her father's hand under her thumb, she chose to be seen. If stories about stubborn folks who refuse to sell tend to stay with you, you may want to subscribe, because this valley is full of them, and most did not end as the loud men predicted. By morning, she had the shape of it. She would line the whole trackside frontage, fence to grade, with the showiest blossoming trees her father's notes described. And she would not plant them all alike. She would stagger them by variety so the bloom did not flare for a single week and vanish, but rolled down the corridor for the better part of a month, one wave handing off to the next. The valley decided she had lost her senses. It was one thing to be robbed by a railroad. It was another thing entirely to spend your grief planting a flower bed for the thief. At the co-op, the men turned it into a joke that lasted the whole summer. The kind of joke that is half cruelty and half worry wearing a grin. "Heard Cora Whitfield is raising a bouquet for the Ashford and Western," one of them said, loud enough to carry across the loading dock. "Reckon she means to wave a handkerchief at the caboose." The county's own orchard man drove out that first autumn to judge the plan for himself, a young fellow with a clipboard and a college manner, and he walked the frontage shaking his head the whole length of it. Fruit trees crowded that tight against a railbed would fight one another for light and starve for water, he told her, and the diesel smoke would foul the leaves into the bargain. He wrote something down that she was not meant to read and advised her, gently, to put the strip into pasture and cut her losses like a sensible woman. Cora asked whether his college had taught him what a tree will do when a person simply refuses to let it fail. He did not have that written anywhere in his notes. Sedgwick himself came back that autumn to close the last of the paperwork, and he found her out along the grade on her knees, setting whips of young cherry into the very cut his company had made. "Planting toward the tracks, Mrs. Whitfield?" he asked. Most people plant a windbreak to get themselves away from a rail line, not to crowd up against it. Most people did not have to watch you take their best quarter, she said, and did not look up from the hole she was digging. She was not raising a bouquet. She was building something with a shape only she could hold in her head, and it took years to draw it in living wood. She set early cherries at the north end where the line came in off the county road, then plums for the middle weeks, then the late, heavy-flowering apples her father had prized above all the rest, so that a traveler moving down the valley would ride out of one bank of blossom and straight into the beginning of the next. Where she could, she grafted, binding good scions saved from the felled trees onto young rootstock, so that the murdered quarter went on living as a green ghost along the edge of its own grave. She grafted the old, exacting way her father had drilled into her before she was 10, a whip and tongue splice cut clean in a single stroke, The two green faces matched flush and bound tight with waxed cloth until the sap could bridge the joint on its own. She chose her rootstock for hardiness and her scions purely for show. And she set the young trees closer along the grade than any book would have allowed, because she did not truly want an orchard there so much as a wall. She counted on the long chill of the valley winters to load the branches with bud, and the cold did not fail her. What the college man had marked down as a mistake, the frost-hard nights were quietly turning into a promise. The labor was slow and had no glamour in it whatever. She hauled water to the raw banks by the barrel through 2 dry summers, because fresh railroad fill sheds moisture like a tin roof and young trees starve for it. She learned the wind that funneled down the open corridor and pruned every leader to lean against it. She kept bees at the top of the bench, partly for the sake of the pollination the young trees would need and partly because a woman working alone finds decent company in anything that hums back. In the evenings she wrote in the journals beside her father's entries, and slowly the 2 hands, his old one and her newer one, came to share the same pages. Not much showed for 3 long springs. The whips became switches, then saplings, then thin young trees carrying a scatter of flower far too sparse to catch the eye from a moving window. Voss stopped mentioning it at the gate, which in a neighbor is its own quiet mercy. Sedgwick was transferred to some other division and forgotten. The trains came through twice a day, freight for the most part, and they slowed for nothing on that stretch, least of all for a lone woman's slow green notion. There was one spring in the middle of those lean years that nearly ended the whole undertaking. A warm February coaxed the young cherries into swelling bud, and then a hard frost came down the valley on a clear and windless night, poised to burn every bud black before a single flower could open. Cora did not sleep. She lit smudge fires of damp straw all along the frontage and walked the rows till dawn with a lantern, shifting the smoke to wherever the cold pooled deepest. And in the gray first light, she found the buds scorched at the edges but still living at the core. She lost the whole north end's bloom that year and kept the trees alive, and it was the nearest she ever came to proving Voss right. She never did tell him how near. The 4th spring was the one that turned. It came in warm and even, with no late frost to scald the buds, and in the 3rd week of April the whole trackside frontage opened nearly at once into a bank of white and pink, almost half a mile long. Cora walked out one morning to see to the bees and stopped dead where the grade curved, because for the first time the picture she had carried for 4 years was standing in the world in front of her. From the rails, at the pace a train takes a bend, it would rise on both sides as a moving wall of blossom, near enough to reach through the window and touch. The first man to slow for it earned no note in any log and no thanks in any report. He was hauling empty hoppers north on a Tuesday, and where the line swung into her frontage he eased the throttle back, not for any rule in the book, but because he wanted the full length of it to last. His fireman leaned clear out the window. Back in the caboose, the conductor felt the drag come onto the train and did not trouble to ask why. When Cora heard the freight gearing down at her curve, she thought first that something had failed on the track. Then she saw the fireman's bare arm out in the blossom light and understood that nothing had failed at all. It spread as real news spreads among working men, which is to say quietly and for keeps. Inside a month every crew on the division knew the Whitfield curve by name, and most of them shaved a few miles an hour off the timetable there through the blossom weeks, until the dispatchers gave up fighting it and simply penciled the slack into the schedule. Then the riders found it. The railway still ran a mixed morning train down the valley in those years. 2 coaches hung on the tail of a freight, and the word got around the depot that the prettiest 3 minutes on the entire route ran past a farm at a curve with a woman's name. By the second blossom, the company at last did the arithmetic it should have done at the very start. A division man Cora had never met drove out, walked the frontage, counted the trees, timed how long the waves of bloom would hold, and went back and proposed a spring excursion. It would be a Sunday train, extra coaches, tickets sold at the station in town for a slow blossom run down the valley and back. The first excursion carried a little over 400 people. They pressed to the glass at her curve, and a few of them, catching sight of the farm stand she had built out by the grade, threw down folded orders and coins wrapped in paper onto the ballast, calling out for cherries and for the pale blossom honey she had begun to sell in squat glass jars. The next year, the same run carried near 700. And the year after that, the company added a third coach and started printing the blossom dates on a handbill. Cora hired 2 girls from a neighbor's farm to work the stand on excursion Sundays, and still they sold out of honey by noon. She began mailing jars to addresses in the city, wrapped in newspaper, and the orders came back with letters. And the letters asked when the trees would flower again, as if she kept the season shut up in a drawer. The honey did nearly as much for her as the fruit. Bees that forage a half-mile of unbroken orchard bloom make a honey pale as straw and mild as new milk, and Cora learned to pull that first crop off the hive separate from the darker summer gather and jar it entirely on its own. She gave it a plain paper label, bearing nothing but the year and the single word blossom, and city grocers took to asking for it by that name alone. One letter she kept for the rest of her days came from a woman who had ridden the excursion as a small girl and written, long after, to say the smell of that honey on warm toast still set her back at the window of a slowing train with her whole family alive and laughing around her. Cora folded the letter into the journal and went on. The man who came to make it all official was named Dorsey, a superintendent, and Cora knew his signature before she ever saw his face, because it was the same signature that had sat at the bottom of the condemnation folder 4 springs before. He stood at her gate turning his hat in his hands, an older man being very careful with his words. "Mrs. Whitfield, I will come straight to it," Dorsey said. "The company would like to set a flag stop at your curve for the Blossom Weeks. We would like to buy your fruit and your honey for the dining cars, and we would like to lease a strip of your ground for a small platform, at a fair rent, this time, and the figure set by you." Cora let him turn the hat a moment longer than plain kindness required. "4 years ago, your Mr. Sedgwick sat at that table," she said, nodding toward the kitchen window, "and he told me that once the cut was made, this ground would not be worth what it had been. Pasture, he said, if it sold at all." "He was wrong," Dorsey said. "He was wrong," she agreed. "Come inside, Miss Dorsey, and sit at the same table, and we will find out together what it is worth now." They made the agreement where the check the color of weak tea had once been slid across the boards to her, and this time the paper ran the other direction. Harlan Voss heard about the lease before the ink was dry, and he came around the following Sunday and leaned on her gate the way he always had, and the 2 of them watched the excursion ease past a half-mile of her blossom with hundreds of faces bright at the windows. "Cora," he said at last, "I told you to go and rest in town." "I remember it well," she said. "I am glad clear through that you are a stubborn woman," Voss said, "and I will not say so a second time. So you had best hold on to the once." The town that had laughed at the bouquet learned in the end to set its own spring by her trees. The cafe kept blossom honey on the counter, the school turned the children out early to wave the excursion past, and the very men who had joked at the loading dock now told every newcomer about the Whitfield curve as though they had believed in it from the first shovelful. Cora let them tell the story however they pleased. She had the trees, and the trees never once cared who stood up to take the credit. The Blossom excursion ran every spring for the rest of the years that Valley kept its passenger trains, and even after the coaches were pulled off for good, the freight crews went on easing down at that curve every April, out of a habit older than the youngest of them had been alive. The railway that had driven its steel straight through her 80 acres had, in the slow accounting of things, made her the single sight that every train on the whole division slowed itself to see. Cora Whitfield grew old at the top of that bench, among her bees and her journals, and when her hands began to shake too badly to hold the knife, she taught her granddaughter Nell to graft, scion bound to rootstock, the bound wound healing across a season into one tree stronger than the two it was made from. On the last page she ever wrote, beneath 40 years of her father's weather notes and her own, she copied out in a careful hand the line Elias had underlined twice, and then she added a line of her own beneath his. "A tree in full flower," he had written, "is the only advertisement that costs a man nothing and cannot be ignored," and under it, in her own steadier hand, she set down this: "They ran a road through the middle of everything I loved, and I decided the road would carry people toward it instead of away." Nell keeps both journals to this day, the two hands in the same book, and the old trees along the grades still open every April whether a train ever comes for them or not. So let me leave it with you the way that Valley left it with me. If a company had run its cold steel straight through the best of what your own father spent his life building, would you have taken their check and gone off to rest easy in town? Or would you have knelt down in the raw cut and planted toward the very thing that wounded you, until you had made the whole line slow down to look?